to college. And we are very honored to be partnering with Ivy Scholars. And so tonight's topic will be on financing your college education and optimizing your applications, standardized tests, and summer programs, right? And so at this time, I just want to do a quick introduction of our organization and the paid internship program that I think is something that will be valuable to our participants as well. And then we will toss it over to our speaker, Sasha Chada. So with that, again, our organization, we celebrate 22 years of service. Actually, it will be 23 years this coming March. And our mission really has been to connect the opportunities and the resources that are available in the broader community to our communities. And so with that, we have had various resources and opportunities, whether it's home ownership program, to leadership capacity building training programs, to foreclosure preventions, to workforce development, and so much more. But tonight, one of the initiatives is really about creating opportunities and equipping young individuals to be able to really achieve their full potential. And I believe college education is definitely one big path, significant path that could change one's future. Unfortunately for the AAPI community, even though we do have one of the highest educational attainment, we actually also have the lowest likelihood of being promoted to management. And I believe that is because of the model minority myth that says that Asians are doing well. Unfortunately, that is not true, especially under the AAPI umbrella, there's 50 groups and 100 languages. And so many of us, we don't share the same language or culture or history. And so again, each subgroup experiences a very different reality. And unfortunately, because of that model minority myth, many stakeholders, policymakers do not recognize that our communities also need resources and opportunities. And also, I think we lose out on the opportunity for solidarity with other communities of color to recognize that we are all in the same boat. And so again, as mentioned, for the last 22 years, we have been in this path to be able to build bridges of understanding, to create opportunities and resources. One other piece is that for many people, young people, people are looking for job training experience. And because you need a job to get hired, or you need experience to get a job, and you need a job to get the experience, and that's a catch-22 situation. However, the county has an amazing program called Youth at Work, and our organization is partnering with them to help individuals 14 through 24 to be able to get paid internships with over 700 employers. And this opportunity can be done remotely or in person. And so if you are interested, I will be putting some of that information in the chat room so that you could sign up. And particularly, we want to make sure that the API youth, who are often, again, left out, will have that access as well. But this program is open to everyone. So I just want to put that, and we will be sharing that. At this time, I want to introduce our speaker, Sasha Chada, who is the founder and CEO of Ivy Scholars. He has, through his organization, helped hundreds of students be able to be accepted and attend their dream college. And so again, tonight, he has some excellent tips and guidance. So we look forward to having you receive this amazing benefit. So Sasha, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hape, and I'm so pleased to be here. It's wonderful to be partnering with such an organization that makes a tremendous impact on the local community. I've got a lot to say tonight about education, and I think there are some parts specifically about merit and need-based funding that'll be especially relevant to the AAPI constituency, especially in the California area. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me jump in. Welcome to our Let me just share my screen with you guys. Here we go. So welcome to our seminar. This is the third in a series of monthly seminars to prepare both mentorship communities at FACE and Ivy Scholars to teach 12 to 18-year-olds and their parents about critical topics in higher education. Hapen, once again, thank you so much for inviting us. I've got lots to say. Let's jump straight into it. So I'm our CEO of Ivy Scholars, Sasha Chana. I lead a company of about 20 mentors working with a few hundred students per year. We've helped about 3,500 students since I founded the company 8 years ago after graduating from the Johns Hopkins University. Over 90% of those students were accepted to one of their reach schools, and 100% made it to their target schools. 10% of our revenue goes to our nonprofit Laurel Scholars, which works with low-income students from Texas, California, New York, and New Jersey, as well as refugees from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Ukraine. On a personal level, I love helping children find a path to awaken their intellectual vitality and leadership characteristics, then demonstrate those in college apps. It's our job to take everything I discuss in this presentation, combine it with expert mentorship and project management, and then mentor high school students through the college application process so they have amazing stories to tell. We've got a lot to cover for today. Here's what it looks like. We're talking about ACT and SAT strategies. Standardized testing has changed a lot over the last decade. The SAT has been revised twice, once in 2016, another time just this past year. The ACT has also been revised once, and the way scores are interpreted by colleges is substantially different in a post-pandemic world. Topic 2, financial aid and scholarships are critically important to students' futures. I think everyone here knows someone who's made an educational decision, not on what they were intellectually passionate about, not on what might be best for them in a perfect world, not on their long-term goals, but about the education they could afford. I'm hoping with my advice and some of the programs in place, more students are going to be picking their best education, not just the most affordable one. Finally, I do want to talk a little bit about independent research. It's a fantastic avenue to develop candidacy for competitive university admissions, especially for top 20 universities. Let's get started. I've got a joke to start us out. A man's shut out of heaven. St. Peter's at the gate. He says, "My SAT scores were too low, that's it?" And it's funny, but there's some truth to it. Students who test poorly face major disadvantages, but recent changes give them new options. Before I dive any deeper, I want to give a caveat. UC schools no longer take standardized testing. Now, in the 2030s, they do plan to develop their own standardized test. In the meantime, this isn't relevant for University of California schools like Berkeley, LA, San Diego, Santa Cruz, Irvine, but it's still critical for almost all the other schools in California, especially USC, the University of Southern California, Stanford, and other private institutions. So let's talk about standardized tests. They help universities compare students. Grade inflation has been a major problem over the last 2 decades. There's direct social pressure on teachers and local high schools to be generous with grades, but standardized tests are far more impersonal. A few basic tips. The best study strategy is to break down 1 to 2 hour segments over the course of 2 months. These aren't the kind of tests you can cram for. I strongly recommend students simulate their testing environment. State-dependent learning, meaning that students learn better in the state they're going to be tested in, is in full effect here. It's my recommendation students go to a library or sit in a classroom after school rather than study at their kitchen table or with their friends. There are tons of wonderful free resources, many of which are linked at the end of this presentation. For a little bit of introductory, both the SAT and ACT break down their questions as subtypes, matching up topics to nationally standardized high school curriculum. This means the data that the SAT and ACT create is meant mostly for school administrators and university admissions officers, not for individualized students. Now, when you seek standardized test preparation, like SAT or ACT tutoring, you'll find most test prep organizations have their own methods of categorizing question subtypes. These will be different than those used on the SAT or ACT. These categorization systems aren't meant to gather a lot of data for administrators or admissions officers. They're meant to help students directly. Now, the caveat is they're less useful for broad statistical analysis and don't match up to nationally standardized curricula. This is the information I want to give all parents and students of the audience in case you're wondering why you get different kinds of metrics from the people helping you on tests versus the people testing you. Now, the biggest question I get is about the difference between the SAT and the ACT. In short, the SAT is more complex, especially in vocabulary. But the ACT forces you to read and think and process and calculate faster. In general, the SAT favors slower and deeper thinkers, especially students who specialize in English and reading. In contrast, the ACT favors students who test faster, especially those who are skilled in quick mathematical calculations. It's also notable that the ACT is more thorough with the Algebra 2 curriculum, including topics that don't generally make their way to the SAT, like logarithms or matrices. The ACT does have a science section, but this is often a misnomer. The science section is really more about reading science. It doesn't require fact-based instruction. You're not bringing in pre-existing knowledge of chemistry, biology, or physics into the test. Instead, students are expected to read articles with charts and graphs, and then draw conclusions from the data presented. Consider the science section more like a logic test with science-flavored logic problems, not a science content-based test. Now, the SAT has gone digital this year. On face, it looks pretty similar in format to the old one, but a lot's changed. Most notably, the reading and writing sections are way shorter. They used to be 500 to 750 words, the length of a little over a page. They've been reduced to 25 to 150 words. In other words, the SAT is becoming a little more like the ACT, demanding you process quickly and answer fast. The SAT's also taken pains to remove idiomatic language, any turns of phrase that are common, say, to American English, but might not be present for international speakers. This is supposed to make the test more neutral, and preliminary testing shows that it's moving in the right direction. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the digital SAT. The SAT is taken on a computer using an app called Blue Book that's created by College Board. Even though remote access allows for the possibility of home testing, College Board hasn't approved that. You'll still be using testing centers. However, this does mean that students no longer need to start at the same exact time around the globe. Students can start in staggered test times because the testing is adaptive. That means an algorithm that assigns different weights to different questions rewards students for getting harder questions right by giving them more points, and harder questions after they get the hard ones right. This means the only way to get the top score on the new digital SAT is to start getting questions right initially, get a perfect first, roughly third to half of your SAT test, and only then will you unlock the maximum difficulty questions that let you get that coveted 1600 score. It's also important to note that each student taking the test is receiving a slightly different version. College Board now has a giant pool of potential questions ranked by difficulty, which are provided by the algorithm dynamically in real time. So each student has their own test generated when they download it for the first time. This ought to drastically reduce issues with test security, including problems caused by student collaboration or test leaks. Finally, quick scoring is one of the most wonderful advantages of this new system. Instead of waiting weeks for your SAT scores, you can get it in days, even hours. Now, this is especially significant because the SAT is becoming the preferred choice. The ACT appeared to dominate from 2005 to 2015, but College Board's partnership with Khan Academy, along with deeper investment in high school infrastructure, reversed that trend. It's still worth it for students to consider either test, and they don't need to take both. But it looks like the nation is going to be a majority SAT nation for the foreseeable future, at least the next decade. Now, this is somewhat geographically determined. You'll note that the heartland has more students taking the ACT, and that coastal areas, especially wealthier, more populous areas, prefer the SAT. California, Texas, New York, New Jersey. In general, the SAT seems to be the way to go. Now, there's a weak correlation between taking the SAT and applying to a highly ranked university. If students test better on the ACT, I still recommend they take it. But all things being equal, it looks like the SAT is predominating. Now, notably, test submissions, that is, students taking either the SAT or the ACT, have dropped due to COVID. College Board was forced to allow test optional policies because COVID obstructed access to test centers. Students couldn't get in safely without worrying about contamination. This accelerated the pre-COVID test optional movement. It doesn't look like the test optional movement is going to entirely take over. Some major universities, including MIT and Georgetown, have already taken a firm stance against test optional submission. They're requiring SATs or ACTs. But most other top 50 schools at least consider students applying test optional. In my anecdotal experience in this admissions cycle in 2023, helping about 75 Ivy League applicants, It's my perspective that most universities strongly prefer SAT or ACT scores for applicants to any school in the top 50. It simply makes admissions officers' job easier. If you have the potential to get a great test score, try for it. Now, the numbers bear this out. It's a little better to submit test scores than not submitting test scores. But I want to give you a quantitative calculus to make the right decision on if you want to submit test scores or not. So I refer you to the idea of interquartile ranges, the 25th and 75th percentile of any university's test score. You can see some of the data on the chart on the right here. Students scoring above the median, the 50% mark, are an attractive applicant. Students below the median, but above the 25% mark, should at least consider sending in SAT or ACT scores. When categorized against major, gender, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, some universities will consider students with SAT scores below the 50th percentile, but above the 25th percentile. Now, students below the 25th percentile shouldn't submit SAT scores. Now, I want to talk about this because I mentioned ethnicity here in particular, and this is very relevant to our AAPI community. For scores in that question mark range between the 25th and the 50th percentile, it is the case that African American, Hispanic, and Native American students should submit. Underrepresented minorities, as universities identify them, generally benefit because universities are willing to accept lower scores. For example, the chart on the left shows you Harvard's willing to accept 25 to 50 points lower for underrepresented minorities. When you zoom into the data on the right, you'll see Black, and to a lesser degree Hispanic, applicants have 2 to 5 times the admit chance of white or Asian applicants when you're controlling for the top performing students that Harvard wants most. So if you're an underrepresented minority with a perfect SAT score, got some good news for you. Now at the left in lower academic deciles, you'll see nobody gets accepted, but at the 5th decile in the chart to the right around the middle, you'll see that 25% of Black students are considered, whereas only about 4 to 8% of white or Asian students are. At the decile for the top 10%, about 60% of Black students get admitted, but less than 15% of AAPI or white students are. When you control for top performing students, the conclusion to draw is that Black African American students have roughly a 4x advantage over students in the Caucasian and AAPI communities. The recent Supreme Court case, which I discussed in our last webinar, has cast doubt on this policy continuing. It's my understanding that if universities continue to publish data that reveals this trend amongst demographics, they'll be in violation of the Supreme Court decision, and there's a possibility the federal government will interfere with admissions processes. Concretely, what this looks like is still incredibly unclear, but it does appear, at least for now, that things may be swinging back in favor of the AAPI communities. Now, to give you a brief summary, all universities will break down your scores into the constituent parts of the tests. For the SAT, that's the critical reading and math sections. For the ACT, that's the English, reading, science, and math sections. Most top-tier schools will emphasize math over reading and writing scores, even for students who are submitting outside STEM majors. For students who want to do English or philosophy or other courses of the humanities, it's still important to get great math scores. So my advice is if students can make at least a math score above average, even if their English score is only between the 25th and 50th percentile, they should still consider submitting, irrespective of demographics. So that's what I've got to tell you about standardized testing. Now, I've got a topic that is the main entree for tonight, and I think it's going to be really important for all of us. Let's talk about how financial aid works. I've got a lot of information here for you, and I'll do my best to break it down. College has gotten way more expensive. Financial aid ought to bridge the gap, either need-based, based on the financial need of different families, or merit-based, based on the accomplishments of different students. Now, the chart on the right shows you that increases in aid have barely outpaced inflation for in-state students. This is tough, and it applies directly to California. A lot of this data was gathered from California universities. But the jury's not out yet. You got 3 sources for aid: government, like FAFSA; private, like CSS; and the university itself. I'm going to cover each of those with you now. Let's start talking about FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. This is a program directly from the US government, irrespective of what state you reside in. It plugs in directly to parents' tax status, taking account of income, but excluding retirement accounts, primary home equity, and some excess capital assets, for example, a brokerage account or cryptocurrency. Most students will qualify for some federal Pell Grants. These are awesome, free money. Many students will also qualify for work study. I've heard a few students raise concerns that this might detract from the time they had to focus on their studies, but in my experience, this isn't the case. Work study programs almost always offer students great jobs that allow time for focus on academics and don't distract them. Now, there's only so much aid you're going to get from the federal government. The vast majority of students will probably receive less than $50,000 of aid. With the average price of some top-tier universities being over $80,000 per year, let's start considering CSS, the College Scholarship Service run by College Board, the same entity that runs the SAT and the AP tests. They've created the CSS Profile, a conglomeration organization that gathers a bunch of different private scholarships together. It demands a little more information than FAFSA, and it's due within 2 weeks of applying to university, but it has the potential to nearly double the amount of federal aid you're receiving. Definitely worth a try. Now, finally, universities will cover need that isn't met by FAFSA or CSS. The previous two programs are generally gateways they're required for students to engage in before they ask the university itself for help. Now, you'll see that pie chart on the right doesn't draw the most sunny conclusion. 2.3% of schools are need blind, meaning they don't consider your financial need when making admissions decisions, so they're just as likely to admit a student from a family background that doesn't have the ability to pay full tuition as a student with a family background that does. 96.7% of schools are need aware. They consider your ability to pay when making admissions decisions. Now, the good news is that a lot of these 2.3% are the schools that everyone wants to go to. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, and MIT are all 100% need blind, both for American students and for international students. Their commitment is to recruiting the best students from anywhere in the world, irrespective of their ability to pay. So it's important to note that neither need blind nor need aware institutions guarantee that their aid will come without loans. Almost all these universities will offer some form of grants, but the vast majority of schools will require students to take some degree of student loans. The most notable exception to this is the Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to a multi-billion-dollar donation from Michael Bloomberg a couple years ago, the Johns Hopkins University now offers 100% grant aid with no need whatsoever. So students who apply to Hopkins and are admitted can expect their college to be paid for by the university. But exactly how much does get paid for by the university? Well, there's something called an institutional aid calculator. Each university has their own website, generally financialaid.universityname.com. Using it takes about 10 minutes. They ask you to plug in tax information, pretty similar to what you add to FAFSA and CSS, and they want a little more information, including other assets such as real property, either inside or outside the US, brokerage accounts, and cryptocurrency. They'll give you an estimate for how much aid the university might grant, alongside the aid they expect you to be able to receive from both FAFSA and CSS. It's your job as an applicant to make sure you receive the FAFSA and CSS aid, because the institutional aid will only kick in after you've exhausted those two forms of aid. Now, notably, institutional aid calculators don't take account of cost of living. So high cost of living states, California, for example, are comparatively disadvantaged against, say, Mississippi or Alabama, states known for a lower cost of living. Realistically, EFC's expected family contributions leave most upper middle class families paying 30 to 70%. But this just covers need-based aid. There's merit-based aid options as well. Let's start talking about those. Funds have gotten tighter since 2008, but more students than ever are receiving merit-based aid. The majority of this aid now comes in the form of grants that don't need to be repaid. Some of it comes in the form of loans. Remember, even when students do have to take out loans, federally subsidized loans will generally have lower than otherwise available interest rates for any financial instrument except a mortgage, and will often come with caveats for repayment, including a delay of interest until students graduate, and possible options for loan forgiveness if students enter the workforce in the public sector. So let's talk about these in a little more detail. There's 3 categories from the bottom: Pell Grants, Veterans Benefits, and State Grants. Those should be pretty clear already. Pell Grants are federal, Veterans benefits are from anyone who served in the U.S. Armed Forces, and state grants come, in your case, from the state of California. Institutional grants come from that EFC, expected family contribution calculator I mentioned earlier. Now, these next items, they bear some talking about. Federal and private loans are two separate programs. My recommendation, where possible, is always to shoot for federal programs. Subsidized loans don't accrue interest. They are made at below market rates by our government to increase educational investment. They're not amazing financial products for the lender, but the federal government takes the hit because it wants an educated citizen base. In general, you should be suspicious of private loans. Banks want to make money off their loans, and the financial instruments they offer are generally created mostly to make the bank money and not to increase the nation's educational status. So this covers just a little bit of what institution, state, and federal grants will ask for when it comes to looking for qualifications from candidates. Now let's talk about actually getting merit aid. There's some great schools out there. Most notably, top-tier public universities that are trying to improve their US News and World Report rankings will often give generous merit aid to attract top students. This is very true for the Cal State system, less so for the UC system. Because UCLA and UC Berkeley have both dipped below the 10% admit rate mark, they become so competitive that it's become less important for both those universities to make an active attempt to recruit top students. They have a lot of faith top students will come to them. Now, lots of private universities will award merit aid for enrollment management. For example, nationally, the University of Alabama, College of the Ozarks, Clark, and Hollins are well known for awarding students a lot of merit aid if they like their profile. Even within California, USC, the University of Southern California, Occidental, and Pepperdine offer lots of merit aid opportunities. In general, private schools will offer you more merit aid, though they're more expensive. Public schools will often have generous merit aid, but not always. Now, when it comes to making sure you maximize your merit aid opportunities, my recommendation is to look for honors colleges. Honors colleges are special programs within universities set apart that hold students to a higher standard of academic rigor and often come with scholarships ranging from low four figures to full tuition and housing assistance. There's 600 honors programs in the US, and most of them will offer students a leg up in both studying at and paying for university. Outside of honors programs, there's other sources of merit aid. I'd recommend checking out FastWeb, scholarships.com, studentaid.gov, and scholarshipsamerica.org. These independent scholarships can be small, but they do add up, and online aggregators like the four I mentioned can help you find and apply for them quickly. Now, I mentioned I had a particular point to make about AAPI community as it intersects with scholarships, both need-based and merit-based funding, and I'm about to make it. Let's go through some data. This data shows you that your chances for merit aid go up radically with grades. The higher your grades, the more likely you are to get merit aid. No surprise here. This shows you the same is true for the SAT, and SATs affect private school rankings a little more than public school rankings. This shows you a simple truth. You take harder courses, more rigorous mathematics especially, and you're more likely to get more aid. Now let's talk about ethnicity. Now, the AAPI community is more likely to have higher grades, higher SAT scores, and take more rigorous courses. But you'll note that white students are more likely, much more likely, to receive grants, even when you compare them to Asian American students with similar SAT scores, GPA, and academic rigor. Most notably, white students are disproportionately likely to receive institutional merit-based grants, much more so than any other minority, AAPI, Hispanic, Latino, Black, or African American. I think this feeds back into the model minority myth that Hayden was discussing. Unfortunately, our nation has decreased its emphasis on promoting AAPI college funding, leading to a situation with a terrible inequity where students who score just as well as white students are given less merit funding purely on the basis of ethnicity. My hope is the Supreme Court decision is going to filter down and affect this kind of decision-making process with individual universities' financial aid departments, but the truth is that's going to take the better part of 5 years to even gather the data to start drawing conclusions. Finally, I want to note that students from higher income families generally perform better and get more merit aid. There's a slight positive correlation between family income and student receipt of merit aid. So for students who come to high income families, my advice is this. You can bargain with small private universities, you take what you can get with large public universities, and you're unlikely to get much in the way of merit aid from large prestigious private universities. Top-tier schools like Harvard or Stanford or Hopkins or Princeton or Dartmouth are unlikely to want to bargain because they already have the ability to track top-tier students. They don't need to incentivize attendance with merit scholarships. So we've covered a lot when it comes to need-based and merit-based aid. The conclusion I want everyone to draw, leaving this part of the presentation, is that there's tons of available sources of aid out there. If you haven't already, you should set a time on your calendar to schedule for October 1st, filling out the FAFSA.gov application for federal aid, for within 2 weeks after your child submits their college application to apply for CSS, and for whenever you got time and have gathered your tax information to look through both FastWeb, scholarships.org, studentaid.gov, as well as student scholarship aggregators. Now that concludes what I've got to say tonight about scholarships. Let's talk about research in high school. All top universities are research universities, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, etc. The job of professors at these universities isn't to teach, like students might expect from their teachers in high school. Instead, professors mostly teach as a side gig. Their real job is publishing research that advances the sum total of human knowledge. Now, students can give universities a vote of confidence in their favor by submitting research to universities along with their applications, demonstrating students' academic abilities. This is one of the best differentiators for students, along with and after strong grades in academic performance, a high standardized test scores, and great essays. This is also more important for top-tier universities. Yale, Columbia, Brown, Harvard will often set aside specific sections in their application for high school students to submit research. This is less important for universities that are still great value, but less selective. For example, the Cal State system. Now, there's more than 20 journals to publish high school level research. I put a few of them here. They cover a vast variety of academic areas, from behavioral and social sciences to medicine to technology to economics and business to psychology. What's important to remember is that while these journals are great starting points, they're not the best ending points. Good research is categorized by something called an impact factor, measuring how relevant a journal is to the general academic discourse by how many times people cite what's written in that journal. My recommendation for students is to start with high school level journals like these, but eventually move on to real peer-reviewed journals that other scientists participate in and look for an impact rating between 3 and 7. Top impact ratings for professional scientists can range from the 30s to the 50s, but my recommendation is students who are not yet joining an undergraduate student body stick to the single digits. It's the sweet spot where they've still got a lot of potential to move the needle on admissions officers' decisions and impress them with a great research publication, but it's not so competitive that they're biting off more than they can chew. Now, there's 4 steps to making a great research project. You've got to find a good question, something nobody's answered before, that's narrow enough to investigate. Then you've got to gather data, hard numbers to analyze, either from students' own experiments or surveys, or from publicly available data sets like those published by our government. Then students have to perform analysis. They need to determine what the data they've gathered means in relationship to their question. For our computer science students, this often involves using machine learning models. For our psychology students, this often involves comparing the data gathered against predominating theories and seeing which comes to light. Finally, for students, the final step is presentation. Students need to share the results of their research with others. Now, this is tough and it can be intimidating. So Ivy Scholars has an amazing research mentor program covering every area that students have asked for. It's our job to help you ideate a great research program, source data and validate it, identify publication venues, perform the analysis, review the paper, and then submit it and make sure it fits the journal standards for publication. Now, this concludes the majority of what I've got to share with you today. So I want to let you know that January 22nd, 2023 at 7 p.m. Pacific time, we're going to another 1-hour webinar. It's going to cover the RD, that is regular decision, application checklist, update letters, do's and don'ts for your final semester, your spring semester course schedule, and strategies for the summer. both for rising freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, as well as for high school graduates. Now, I'm about to enter the Q&A section, but before I do, I just want to remind everyone, Ivy Scholar's job is to take everything we've discussed in this presentation, combine it with mentorship and project management, and coach our students to get an amazing education. We help a few hundred students a year for the last 8 years, and I've got a chart, the Ivy Scholars difference, on the right-hand slide of this slide about our impact. You can sign up for a consultation with Ivy Scholars using the free QR code. Now, in the meantime, I'd like to answer some questions that the audience has asked. Let's start with this. Where can I find merit non-essay scholarships and grants? The good news is that both FastWeb and scholarships.org have created filters for their websites so that you can select scholarships on the basis of what they require, including an essay or not an essay. In terms of scholarships available for current transfer students, my first piece of advice is to look at the undergraduate department to which students are applying. Most departments will have existent scholarship programs for transfer students. It's also the case that the aggregate sites like studentaid.org and FastWeb will have opportunities for transfer students, but I'd expect these to make up no more than 15% of the overall scholarship pool. Now, the final question is one I had to answer about 20 years ago, and it's on my mind a lot. It reads, my children are mixed white Asian. I keep wondering which race they should endorse. Oh boy. Well, in a perfect world, I would give you a very kind and simple answer that any race students choose to identify with is their own business and it won't result in any kind of discrimination. That statement isn't true. I just gave you data. White students get merit-based aid about 15 to 20% more of the time than Asian American Pacific Islander students do. White students also face less ethnicity-based discrimination, and the recent Supreme Court case highlighted a tremendous amount of anti-Asian American discrimination, not a lot of anti-white American discrimination. The cruel truth of it is that white Americans are still terribly advantaged in our country's educational system, especially at the top. So my advice as the leader of Ivy Scholars and someone with white and Asian ancestry himself is that students who identify as white have a tremendous leg up in the application process, and there's no reason not to take advantage of that. Now, that's a sad note to close on, but I do want to leave everyone with a little bit more information. Between research programs and great essays and great SAT scores and solid grades, students of any ethnicity, AAPI, white, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Native, or other, have a chance to get into the university of their dreams. It's been my job, pleasure, and privilege for about the last decade to make this happen. If you feel Ivy Scholars is the right fit for your family, if you feel we can help you, scan the QR code at the bottom right of the screen, and I'd be happy to meet with you for a consultation. Now, guys, that finishes everything we've got to talk about for tonight. I hope I helped you. I hope it was informative. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and wish you all a wonderful evening.
All right.